So to understand Fox, I think it'd be, as you said, it's the legitimacy of media, the mainstream media, has been the one thing that's been thrown into question. And
Yeah.
the problem I see is that the press is not merely broken in the internet age. It seems to be actually unfeasible on its own.
What
To the-
exactly do you mean by that? Like, the press is broken, specifically.
So the key issue of brokenness, and you bring it up, this idea of legitimacy through unbiasedness is one of the standard models that's occurred since the 70s and 80s, but also harkening back to the days of the fairness doctrine. This idea that for journalism to be true, it must be unbiased. The people who do it must be so detached from political opinion that only then can you truly believe what is happening.
Right.
And the problem was that this view was flawed to begin with. It is impractical now, and moving away from it seems to be almost too difficult for the press to do. So let's start off from the beginning. It was flawed to begin with. Now, the main person I cite here is the NYU professor Jay Rosen, one of the students of Neil Postman. He speaks incessantly about this problem of the things that underpin the unbiased framework. The unbiased framework is very much this kind of ritual that is undertaken that is kind of self-destructive in a way. So if you were to think about your neighbor, imagine one day, you're talking to your neighbor, and your neighbor speaking to you, and they say, "Listen, Josiah, I am a truly unbiased, completely politically neutral person. Let me tell you something about the politics of the day. You can trust me. I have no politics in me at all. No bias." Would you believe them?
Of course not. That's obviously not the case.
So of course, I could just end my discussion there. Impossible to believe anybody's unbiased. Bam, done. But it's of course deeper than that. The problem is that it's like this entire narrative of the framing of unbiasedness is incredibly problematic, because what we're talking about when we say bias, we deal with bias in our lives, and we don't usually have a problem with it. Every time we speak to an individual, we assume they have a self-interested bias of some extent. So where's the problem? Well, this idea is that really what we're talking about is trust. And this is how I try and break it down normally for people. You're not looking for media that's unbiased, you're looking for media that's trustworthy. And people have told the populace that unbiasedness is kind of like the symbol of trustworthiness. How do you believe somebody? You believe them because they have no bias.
That is the narrative that has been relatively pushed over the past couple decades, yeah.
And so the only way that you get around this, since as we've said, bias collapses in on itself, the only way you get around this is you need to find new ways of establishing trust. And Rosen speaks about this in a few different ways. One of the ways that he speaks about is that one of the few ways of establishing trust in the modern era is transparency. Nowadays, we have a lot of the tools for transparency, thanks to the widespread availability of social media, of cameras, of many different ways of communicating with a broad sum of people, that just more transparency in general is a way of building trust. Now, the problem, though, is that this model of establishing trust through transparency has the potential for blowback. If a person, goes to a reader as a journalist and they tell them, "This is my politics. I believe this, I believe that, I have donated to this person before, I have voted for this person," there's a risk that people will see that, and then that will be almost the ticket to dismissal. That, oh, you support this? Opinion discarded. In fact, you see this discourse on the internet actually quite a few times. It usually occurs with media review, where somebody will have some litany of media review, and then some person in some comment or some thread somewhere will say, you gave X a 3 out of 10? All opinions discarded.
Right.
And for a good sum of people, they at least feel that this is a legitimate form of, processing information, which is concerning.
Obviously not the case, yeah.
And I don't quite know how you get around that. Because, like I said, people are so enmeshed in this framing of bias that transparency doesn't just, it doesn't circumvent the framing. It falls within it and risks, being attacked by that same frame.
I'm not so sure that it would be impossible to get out of this framework of bias, as you put it. Although I understand, since it is the ration or the common sense, even though that it may not be the case, the commonsensical way of looking at things, right? And when I say commonsensical, I mean it's a constructed framework, of course, like any framework, right?
Mm-hmm.
I am very suspicious of the, or not necessarily suspicious, but I'm hesitant to accept that it's impossible, at least within our current society, to get out of that idea, because certainly some people have taken advantage of what is it? They've said to basically throw it out entirely, right?
That's example, the recommendation of a large sum of people. Yep.
Yes, exactly. Right. What would, in your view, be a good? Instead of just throwing out, you can't just throw it out entirely, right? The system's already in place, right? I think that my way of negotiating would be exactly that. Understanding that you can negotiate with not necessarily the truth, but with trustworthiness, right? Trustworthiness is about relationships, and it's about a give and take sort of thing, right? So we expect a certain thing from the people who are producing news content, let's say, but we also, as the readers and consumers of media, have a responsibility to be discerning, right? Is this the solution? Is this a way of getting past this kind of notion of bias? Because from what I'm reading, from what you're saying, right, it sounds to me like there's it sounds to me like you view people as unable of breaking out of the system, right? Or that people have the inability to actually be discerning about the news that they can, consume.
I believe people can be discerning. I think that is one of the great mistakes of much of the discourse about the problems in journalism, is this presumption that we need more media literacy. I think that was media literacy is good, but I think it's misguided. I think that it completely almost disparages some of the individuals on the right who are actually quite intelligent and quite media literate, exceptionally media literate, but apply the tools in such a way, because of this biased framework, they apply the tools in such a way that they end up, kind of missing the truth by getting bogged down with this, bias as the surrogate for trust. When Dana Boyd, another researcher with the Open Data Society at NYU, she speaks about this this problem, that really our problem is that we have radicalized skepticism in a way that people get gaslit into not being able to believe anything. And that in this vulnerability, without being able to believe anything, they become more susceptible to the things that are, easily fulfilling of their emotional wants and needs. So it's this idea that most people who, just quickly, most people, on the right, they do engage with left-wing news, and vice versa. The echo chamber argument that was proposed, not too long ago, many researchers like Brennan Nyan at Dartmouth, they very much say that this is very much overblown in the media. This risk of echo chambers, the talk of echo chambers, you still see talked about a lot online. Echo chambers are, of course, a problem, you can say, in some broader sense, but it's not the source of political polarization. It's not the source of a lot of the issues that come with, democracy and the press. The bigger issue seems to be that, it's more specific than that. People on the right will read, will watch CNN, and will read, the Washington Post, mainstream media, but for their sake, left-wing media. But then they'll also engage with, back when it was available on YouTube and easily accessible, InfoWars and the other conspiratorial types. And they would just, kind of approach both with this, very, bold openness to them that, Alex Jones says some, very questionable things. I have not bought into everything he said, but sometimes, he makes a point. It's this idea that, like, to be completely dismissive is almost like a symbol of, like, anti-intellectualism. The presumption of the middle ground, the truth lies in between, has been something that's been reinforced for quite some time, that it's very difficult for people to break out of.
So, wait, what exactly are you proposing by saying that, right? Because, yes, by saying that, you're kind of challenging a very old notion, yes, that the truth is in the middle ground somewhere, right?
Mm-hmm.
What exactly are you proposing by saying that? Like, what exactly would be your suggestion of an alternative? Possibly.
So, in terms of solutions, like, the problems in media are all very difficult. As
Right.
I said, if you buy into Danah Boyd's gaslighting view, that, information is being weaponized by, let's say, hostile, fake news press, and maybe even foreign press like Russian television and the like, to make people just doubt everything they hear, and then this ends up gaslighting them to the point to which they can't believe anything. The recommendations we know from, women's rescue centers and help centers, when you have a partner who's gaslighting you, the only solution that they recommend is that you leave them, but you can't leave, the current media ecosystem. That's
you can't
not
leave
an
the
option.
structure. Yeah.
Exactly. So we're kind of in new waters, so to speak, in terms of we have to deal with the fact that, whenever a fact comes out that could be problematic or special interests, they can utilize media, whether anonymously or through, major publications. They can utilize it to just counterpunch and make you doubt the source that information came from. And in terms of how we move forward, I don't even think Danah Boyd herself had too much to say. She had her points. They were very general points about, essentially kind of more changing our perspective in terms of education from critically doubting things to identifying what makes something believable, to focusing on what constitutes good evidence and working up that. And in terms of just a more broader question of how do we create a press that escapes the trappings of, the assumed middle ground of, unbiasedness, framing, and all of the other problems I could list. There are a few other specific problems as well, but to focus on the more solution-oriented approaches, one of the first problems, and the problem that we haven't quite touched upon, the number one, honestly, in many people's minds, is that the press is not economically sustainable. And we could talk all we want about what what the most beautiful, perfect, newspaper, in the world would look like. But if it's incapable of making enough revenue to keep itself afloat, we're kind of in the realm of fiction. And
honestly, honestly, that idea that we oftentimes actually forget the fact that media has to make money, right? Like, in order for it to be independent, right? State, like separated from the state, right? Physically independent, for it to operate as that fourth estate, it has to be, fiscally and economically viable. Especially in a capitalist society, it's not like they're doing this shit for charity, right? They're trying to make money, and that in and of itself pushes forward a whole slew of biases, which go further to challenge that notion that the media can be intrinsically unbiased. I'm sure that you probably know of Chomsky's 5 filters. Chomsky and I think it was Wortham? Chomsky and Herman. They wrote a paper talking about free speech, media, and exactly why press can't be unbiased, or why press is automatically a capitalist structure. Actually,
in all honesty, I haven't
actually
focused too much on the Chomskyist approach. Chomsky is a very bold figure in terms of criticizing the press. He is, according to my research, one of the few people who is willing to say that the press is truly a tool of the government, even in democratic society, in a way that is, I think, very much bolder and dangerous than many of the other theories. Most would say that the press is a tool of power interests of corporations, of government, because the press needs to protect itself from retribution. The government has access. By giving interviews, they are creating, a product that has a high return for the news industry. If the government refuses to work with a newsroom, refuses to work with ABC or CNN or the CBC, that the lack of access to political machinations means that you can't have products that are, have as good of a return. And then you end up with that problem of, how do you keep yourself afloat? Likewise, of course, with corporations, it's all about trying to eliminate risk and the risk of lawsuit and the risk of libel. And that is the main thing that drives a lot of newsrooms to not go too hard, not merely on corporation, but on individuals within the corporation, which I think are more important, because the individuals, the power elites, those wealthy individuals who sit on corporate boards, they are some of the most, powerful players in the modern capitalist system that rarely gets spoken about for that risk, that if you speak of them as people and identify them as people, you very much can put yourself in a risky place if the facts and the reporting are not like 200, 300% rock solid, not going to get you in trouble.
Yeah. It's funny, actually. Just in talking about that, like the ways in which the media is controlled, or it is a power relation in a way. You've mentioned 3 of Chomsky's points, actually. You know how I mentioned 5 filters, right? The 3 filters that you mentioned actually are media elite, flack, and ownership or advertising, right? The idea that a company, like a media company, can get shit on by powerful corporations, the government, etc. That's made up in this idea that they can be attacked, flack, right? So they minimize risk, etc. You just explained this. The advertising, the fact that they have to make money, and the idea that that the government has the ability to basically shut off information to a specific newsroom whenever they want, right? That's media elite. The idea that there's very specific people in specific positions of power which have the ability to give information, which the media will want to sucker up to, right?
Mm-hmm.
Again, all these things are ways that the media is influenced. I mean, and Chomsky's making these observations in the 70s. Like,
Mm-hmm.
honestly, these sorts of things have become even more and more pronounced, especially in today's climate, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I kind of wanted to move to that because we're nearing the end of our time. I don't want Amy to do too much editing. The thing that we need to get up to today, because most of our discussion has been focused in the 60s, the 80s, and then probably a bit in the early 2000s, is the idea of today's media climate, especially with the Trump White House. You can't look at a media and democracy these days without looking at the Trump White House. It's a media phenomenon, right? The fact that he's there, the fact that he's discredited, a centralistic or leftist media by calling it an enemy of the people. All of these things speak to the influence that, or not influence, but the relationship that media has with democracy, and figuring out how to navigate this presidency and where to pick up the pieces afterwards, because he's done a lot of damage, right? Will be important in figuring out what that relationship is like in the future.